Eventually, the pandemic will subside and the humanitarian crisis will pass, but the economic crisis will remain and may even deepen. Now, that's where lessons from previous recessions become more relevant, but they still need to be interpreted with care. The root of any economic crisis is a mismatch between supply and demand, whether that's in money markets, labour markets, or consumer markets. Now, normally, in a normal recession, the main problem is a lack of demand, and so the main task is to stimulate demand, often through marketing. But in this recession, we see a mix of supply and demand problems, and that changes things. How firms should react depends on the precise mix of supply and demand problems that they face and how those problems change as the crisis evolves. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Every firm's crisis is unique and will require a slightly different approach. Different firms face a different range of problems. Some sectors are doing really badly, some are doing quite well. Pubs and restaurants are closed, staple food and drink is selling as well as ever. Some firms face demand problems, other firms face supply problems. If you're selling luxury goods, you've probably got a problem with demand. If you're selling toilet roll, the problem is to meet that demand with adequate supply. For some, this is an existential crisis. For others, it's an opportunity. Cinemas and theatres may go bankrupt, Netflix may clean up. Some firms have deep pockets, others face a cash flow crisis. So within the tech sector, little startups may have problems raising the next round of funding, but the big established tech firms like Apple and Google and so on have big reserves of cash and may actually be able to buy some of the small fry. Some strategically important firms will get government support, others not so much. Some need to focus on the short term, others can afford to take a longer term view. Different firms need different strategies and they'll need to evolve those strategies over time. So think about how supply and demand and costs and competitive context will evolve for your brand. First, think about supply. Many firms face problems with supply and distribution of their products and services at the moment. Sometimes they're simply inaccessible to customers, or there may be shifts in demand which have caused unexpected shortages, or there may be staff absences or other disruptions to the supply chain. These kind of supply and distribution problems place fundamental constraints on what marketing can achieve. So you need to build your marketing plan in the context of thinking about supply and distribution and how they will change as the crisis proceeds. If demand exceeds supply, it's hard for your advertising to be profitable, at least in the short term. Now, there are some exceptions. So communications that actually help to alleviate supply problems are an exception. An obvious example is any kind of direct selling or online selling, where communications actually are part of the supply mechanism. But other kinds of short selling advertising really won't work if your product is not available to people or if you can't satisfy demand. So there is a much smaller role for that kind of hard sell activation during the supply constrained phase of the crisis for some businesses. Brand building doesn't face quite the same problem. There is an argument that even if your product is not currently easily available, you might continue to do brand building with an eye to future sales once supply is lifted. For example, there is a story that during World War II, Wrigley's continued to advertise chewing gum in the UK, even though it was unavailable here. And they were rewarded at the end of the Second World War, when rationing was over, by extremely high sales. Chewing gum sales went through the roof. So if you've got the pockets for it, there may be an argument for continuing brand building advertising at a certain level now, even if you've got supply problems, with an eye to the future. But this does require great sensitivity. Get it right, and you could boost morale, as Wrigley's did during the Second World War, and strengthen your brand for the future and be rewarded with great sales when all this is over. But get it wrong and you could annoy people and you could look irrelevant and opportunistic. So it has to be done very carefully. Next, think about demand. Some categories do much better than others when times get tough. Demand for yachts goes down, but demand for baked beans goes up. So think about how demand will evolve in your sector over the short, the medium, and the long term. First, the short term, the lockdown. Can your brand capitalise on the retreat to a simpler, thriftier, more home-based lifestyle? Or could it be adapted to that world? Or do you just need to wait for the lockdown to end? Then the medium term, the recession. Can your brand thrive when people are cutting back financially? Can you adapt it to a less affluent world? Or do you just need to wait until the good times return? And then the long term, the recovery and beyond. Is there a long-term marketing job for you to do to ensure that people remember you and come back to you when all this is over? Do changes in consumer behaviour and market structure now pose long-term threats to your business? And is there an opportunity to gain market share now with an eye to long-term profit? Could you even kill or acquire less resilient competitors? So think about how supply and demand will change as the crisis evolves and how to keep them in balance. And to do that, you're going to need to use all 4 marketing Ps. First P, product. Can you adapt the mix of products and services that you offer in some way? That could mean a minor tweak like changing the pack size to something really major like redeploying production from perfume to hand sanitizer. Second P, place, or what we would normally call distribution. Can you change the way people access your products and services in some way? Obvious examples right now include online selling and direct delivery. Third P, price. If supply exceeds demand, then do consider discounting. But be very cautious about this. Don't discount too deeply or too often. Don't make yourself too reliant on price promotions to stimulate demand, because it erodes your margins and can cause profit problems later on. If you can, find other ways to stimulate demand rather than becoming dependent on price promotions. And that brings us to the 4th P, promotion, or what we would normally these days call marketing communications. Now, marketing communications, including advertising, are usually the best way to stimulate demand without affecting your margins. They can also sometimes help with supply by selling direct. Now, the ROI from advertising and other marketing communications depends on those other 3 Ps, on the mix of products and services, on the way you deliver them, on your distribution and your supply, and on your pricing and your margins. So get the other 3 Ps right first before you start to communicate. The ROI from marketing communications also depends on the competitive context. It depends on what your competitors are doing, whether they're advertising heavily or whether they're cutting back. And it also depends on media prices, on the media marketplace. We're going to look at those issues in part 4, and we're also going to look at how you can use advertising and other marketing communications to help you on the road to recovery.